Okay, for today, our goal is to review yesterday's stuff, which was on writing sinusoidals. And that would be like this. Imagine for a moment you have a wave. And if I give you a high spot and a low spot, it doesn't matter which ones. It does kind of. They need to be in a row. But I'm going to choose to give you that one and that one. You are going to be able to write the equation for the line that goes, or the line that makes that, which I would always use cosine. And it's going to look generally like A cosine of B, and then there's theta minus C, and then it's plus D. All right, so that's the basics. Do you remember that line that runs down the middle? It's got an official name. It's called the midline. I looked it up. And that's really, really critical. All right, so now I'm going to give you those 2 points. But I'm not going to do it in a super easy way. You need to unplug that headphone. Thank you. You're going to get this point is pi over 6. And this point is pi over 3. And the height of this one, the low spot, is 4. And the high spot is 6. That tells you everything you need to know to write this sinusoidal using cosine. Try it. Act like it's a test. Can you do it already, right now? Pause for a second while you give this a try.
Is this like a normal test question?
Yep. Okay, let's see how you did here. And my first thought is we should probably find this midline, and it's really easy. I made it so easy. You average the 4 and the 6 if you want to think of it that way, and you would end up with 5. And then that goes where? Well, it does not go here, but it is true that the beginning and the end are now known. The end is 5. The D is 5. How many put the 5 there at the end? Good, because you shifted it up 5, right? And then, how about that other one? It's known because you now know that it goes this far up. It goes from 5 to 6, so that's how you find the amplitude. So the amplitude is now 1. You know the beginning and you know the end. All right, how about the middle part? Well, the middle part is, of course, the hardest part. One part's pretty easy. If you just remember that cosine is the high spot right here should be over here, and it's how far over is it shifted. You can always think of that as a shift to the right of however much this point is shifted over. Now, wait a minute. We don't have this point. We have this point. It'll still work. You don't have to use that first point. You can say it's shifted over that far. It's going to be okay. It's the x value that of the first x value we know. So I'm going to put that in there. It's pi over 3. It's true and weird that you could have found this one and put that in also. All right. Then last but not least is the B term. I like to recite the formula pretty much every time because you're going to use this a lot. And it might be a weird one on the test. You have to figure out how to use this thing. The period is 2 pi over B. And I don't know B, so then I must have been told the period somehow. And I was. Because I know that either from peak to peak, that would be 1 full period. Or I could take this thing I do have, which is how far this is, and then double it. So first I'd take pi over 3 minus pi over 6 to see how far apart they are. Pi over 3 minus pi over 6. And then I'm going to double that. Well, first thing I'm going to do is change this into 2 pi over 6 minus 1 pi over 6 gives me 1 pi over 6. That's how far apart this was right here. Now I can double that. So that's 2 pi over 6. That's what its period is 2 pi over 6. Now with a little bit of multiplying by b, canceling this, I can get 12 pi over 6 is equal to, where'd my b go? Oh, that's a b. That's wrong. Sorry. That's b times 2 pi over 6. It's not a 6, it's a b. That's a b. Okay, sorry. So this is b equals 2 pi divided by 2 pi over 6, which means 2 pi times 6 over 2 pi, and the 2 pi's canceled, so b is 6. How many of you were able to come up with 6 on your own without me?
I can do it again after you show me.
Okay, that's the main thing is, do you see what you did wrong? Looks like only about half the class came up with 6. It was 6. Yes?
So I thought the period was pi over 2.
Okay,
Because
hold on. I'm not sure that it was. So tell me what your thought process was to make you think the period was pi over 2.
3 pi over 6 is the same as pi over 2.
Okay,
And
but wasn't this distance right here, wasn't that distance pi over 6?
yeah.
It was. Because here, think of it this way. I'd take these two, subtract them, and this one's twice as big as this one is. So it makes sense. It's pi over 6. So I just don't want you to go too far with your example, because if that's pi over 6, then you just have to double that, which is going to be 2 pi over 6, not 3 pi over 6.
Oh yeah. Okay, so 2 pi over 6.
Okay, 2 pi over 6. I can buy that.
Okay.
And if the period is 2 pi over 6, that's where I put that in right there.
Okay.
And then it was just a bunch of solving from there.
Okay, yeah, I see where.
Okay. All right. Next, let's go to a kind of a normalish question. Just graph. Easiest question ever. 2 cosine of theta. Always start by graphing the parent one, and then see if you can make the right tweaks. Now pause while you give that a try. Okay, so first thought, here's what regular cosine looks like. It's like a valley. And it ends at 2 pi. Why is that the most important spot? Because then you can cut it in half. And halfway through would have to be pi. And then half of that, this gap is kind of messed up, but that should be over a little bit. That would be at pi over 2. And then this spot right here is at 3 pi over 2. But on a test, I would have given you credit for this. This is close enough. Okay, now, well, 0 is good to put in there. You don't have to. This is 1, and this is -1. You do need to put those in. Now, what changes? Well, it's so simple. This one was probably barely an R2. That 2, go here, and you're done. But now I'm going to tweak it and make the problem more complicated. This is more like what it would be on a test. Now we're going to go 4 theta minus pi in parentheses, and that's going to change your x-axis labels quite a bit. Again, put this where theta used to be, 4 theta minus pi. Now the first thing I don't think everybody knows is that you have to factor this kind. You know, you've heard the saying, if you can factor it, you should, but you might not even know that you have to on this kind. 4 theta, and see if you can factor that right. 4 comes out. See if you can do it. Okay, did you go 4 and then theta minus pi? I'm glad you didn't do that. What should the pi have on it so that when you multiply this and this, that it'll work? Pi over 4 is correct. Very good. All right. Now, do you get that we have now got it shifted a quite different thing? And some people aren't going to get this. They're going to be like, wait a minute. I would have shifted it pi to the right. Well, you'd have done it wrong. You need to have it factored first. I'll try to explain why. When it's like this, multiply normally comes before subtract, so you'd have to do the subtract first, and then you'd renumber it. But when there's parentheses here, like we've redone it with parentheses by factoring that, parentheses are supposed to be first, but then they don't go first because you're on the inside. So this must be, the 4 has to be first. So that's how you should do it. Factor it. Don't do it this way. Factor it. And then we'll renumber it first, and then at the end, after it's renumbered, then we'll shift it right pi over 4. All right, so how do I renumber it? I go here, and remember that the period is 2 pi over b. And what is our b? It's 4. So 2 pi over 4. Do you get that this 2 pi here needs to change to 2 pi over 4? And if I do that to the last one, I got to do it to all of them. And I'm going to multiply by 1/4 on all of them. And now I'm going to have pi over 8, pi over 4, 3 pi over 8, and I'm going to simplify my 2 pi over 4 into pi over 2. If I want to count those up nice and cleanly, it'd be 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, 3 pi over 8, 4 pi over 8, which is the same as pi over 2. All right, that was the hardest part. These 4 new answers. Do you think you could get those? That's really what's going to separate the A's from the B's in this next test, is can you do that? All right, because once you've done that, this last part is super easy. Do you get I was supposed to move it over? So I'm going to go up here and see how am I supposed to move it? That's telling me to move it over right pi over 4. Well, if I did my renumbering right, I can see how far that is. This is how far pi over 4 is, because that's what this spot is now. So that's 2 marks. And that tells me I should move my graph over 2 marks from where it is right now. So let me put that, I'm just going to draw one right over the top here. And I'm going to grab it and move it over 2 marks. Oops. I thought I could grab it and drag it over. Maybe not. I'm going to try undoing that. I guess I will have to redraw it. This is going to be tougher. But I'm going to take every dot and move it over 2 marks. And then this dot was here, and it goes over 2 marks. This dot was here, and it goes over 2 marks. And it goes. There's my valley. The black one is my final answer, except I don't know if you can see this, but it isn't shifted over all the way. Right over there?
There's water in my mouth.
Okay. All right. So anyway, I'm going to, black. There. I'm going to label this spot and this spot, because some kids are going to try to turn their test in and not have labels under or over their graph. This gap right here loses you at minimum 5% off. All right, so let's figure out what those are. This first mark was pi over 8. The second one's pi over 4, but the first one's the key one. 1 pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, 3 pi over 8, 4 pi over 8. That spot is 5 pi over 8. You get how I did that? I counted it up. Just knowing the first mark is huge. So they're counting by pi over 8s. So since this one was 5 pi over 8, the next one must be 6 pi over 8. And yeah, you can reduce that, and you should. Do you have to number forever? Nope. Just have to have it numbered all the way underneath your graph. You can't have part of your graph just hanging there without any labels. All right. That was kind of intense. One more. Let's see if you can handle this one. One half cosine of 3 theta minus pi in parentheses. That is about as intense as it would get. So start with graph and cosine. The amplitude out front, that's easy to handle. But will you know what to do on the inside? I'm going to pause while you give that a try. Okay, so here's how it should have looked. First of all, did you have a valley? Second of all, did you label it with 2 pi? Pi over 2, that's cutting everything in half. And then I go back and call this 3 pi over 2. And then this is 1 and this is negative 1. That should be pretty automatic by now. If it's not, you need to work on that. Those should just be like automatic, easy. Now, tell me what to do, sir, on the 1/2 in the front.
I've been here, wait.
The 1/2 right up there, the amplitude change. What should I do?
Yeah, the y should be 1/2.
You are correct, sir. The y's should be 1/2 and negative 1/2. Okay? Next up, CW, the water drinker. Ready? What do I do with these numbers?
I multiply them by 1/3.
Multiplying by 1/3 is correct, sir. But let's do this first. Factor that for me to show the 3 coming out in front. Did you do that or not?
So you take a 3 out, and then in parentheses it's theta minus pi over 3.
You are correct. All right, awesome. Now, this 3 here, because the period equals 2 pi over b, and b is 3. If period has to be 2 pi over 3, then this has to be divided by 3, so we multiply by 1/3, multiply by 1/3, multiply by 1/3, and multiply by 1/3. Final answers, pi over 6, pi over 3, 3 pi over 6, which could be reduced to pi over 2, and 2 pi over 3. Raise your hand if you had those right. Awesome. Mr. W.
Oh, on the test,
Or V, sorry. Go ahead.
pi
Yep.
over 6.
Yep.
Do we have to simplify?
I want you to, but if your only mistake in this whole thing was saying leaving this as 3/6, I'd probably just let that go.
We'll simplify.
You are supposed to simplify them. So simplify them, but if everything was perfect except one little tiny thing like that, I couldn't bring myself to mark it wrong. 2 things like that, though, that'd be enough to lose part credit at least. All right, so what's next? We have to move it. ER. Do you see the shift up there on the inside? Do you know where it goes?
Something like this. Oh my god.
What does that mean?
Right?
Sorry, my brain, like, the session timed out.
I'm going to come back to you.
Thank you.
How about you, sir? It's shifted to the right, isn't it?
Yeah.
How far?
Well, this is pi over 3 in the middle there, would you just move it like 2 sections then?
You want to move it pi over 3, and you were saying since this is pi over 3, you should move it 2 spots. You are exactly right, sir. So we're going to move this 2 spots to the right. So now our valley starts right here, and it ends right here. 2 more spots to the right. And then these are tricky. I like to do it in 4 parts. There. Maybe I should have used a different color, maybe black. Here's your final answer, the black one. There you go. That's about as intense as they would get.
Don't you have to add another?
Do you have to add something else? Oh, you should number underneath it. You are correct. I should label these 2 spots. So these were pi over 6s. So that's 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, and 6 pi over 6, aka pi. Okay. There, that's enough practice. we started with the sinusoidals, where you have to find that midline that runs down the middle. You know, just always remember to start with that, and those aren't that bad. Okay, so now, here comes your quiz. Do you have a question first? Okay, I need to get the quizzes out, so those kind of questions can come in a minute.